This next session requires all of us to fasten our seatbelts. It's a serious conversation around agricultural productivity. So if our productivity has challenges, then we have a problem in the continent. So we have eminent persons who are today discussing issues around agricultural productivity. And the session is titled Road to Abuja II. I'm sure you're all aware that in 2006, there was a declaration at Abuja concerning fertilizer development in the continent. So it is expected that the heads of state and government will be speaking at another summit, which will be termed Abuja II. Hopefully the name will still remain. And so this session will be looking at the next steps. So what are the next steps towards the Abuja II summit? What is it that we need to be putting on the table to inform the next Abuja summit? So the next team of experts are people who are very conversant in the topic around fertilizer in the African continent. This session will be moderated by Professor Richard Mkandawire. Professor, I hope you have joined us. Professor is trying to join. I think I spoke to him a few minutes ago, but I'll introduce him anyway, hoping that he will join us when I finish this introduction. Many of you are familiar with Professor Mkandawire. He is known as one of the main architects of the Comprehensive Africa Agriculture Development Program, CAADP, this big animal called CAADP, which everybody in the continent, 54 at least African countries, are familiar with the CAADP framework. So Professor Mkandawire is currently the Africa Director for the Alliance for African Partnerships. And he is also the chairperson of the Malawi Commission, the Malawi Planning Commission, I beg your pardon. Before this position, he was the vice president of the African Fertilizer and Agribusiness Partnership, which was driving innovative interventions of efficient and effective delivery of fertilizer among smallholder farmers in Africa. And so this makes Professor Mkandawire the right pick, I suppose, to moderate this session. And I'm still looking at the list of panelists and presenters. I still don't see Professor Mkandawire. And I'm just wondering whether Professor Tom Jane, you could just step in for now while Professor Mkandawire organizes to join the session. Is that something you can do for us for now, Professor Tom?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'd be happy to do that, although I just reached Richard on WhatsApp and I have his phone. So I think that maybe he can actually proceed. Oop, he just got off. Okay, no, I'll be happy to do it, Nali Shibu.
Okay, so while Professor is joining us, I'll help him on the other side.
Okay.
You can continue and just welcome our keynote presenter. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Shibu. Okay, well, in this 7th annual ReNAPRI conference, I think we are especially privileged to have the World Food Prize Laureate for 2020 in our midst, who will be giving the keynote, Professor Rattan Lal, an eminent soil scientist. And we're really overjoyed to have you, Prof. Lal, with us today. So with no further ado, let me pass the floor to you so that you can give us your keynote address. The floor is yours, Prof. Lal.
Thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Great. I'll put it on view and get started. Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation and this opportunity. As we discussed before, the topic I was suggested to discuss is enhancing input responsiveness of soils of sub-Saharan Africa. Why Abuja I fertilizer target of 50 kilogram per hectare by 2050 was not met? As we know, the current rate is 17 kilogram per hectare. So that's the question I'm going to address, why we didn't meet the target. Perhaps farmers are not sure of the effectiveness of fertilizers. Perhaps cost is prohibitive to resource per farmer. Perhaps the nutrient use efficiency is low. Maybe soil physical and biological factors are not optimal. Maybe there are high losses by runoff, erosion, and volatilization. Therefore, the question of soils are not responsive to input need to be addressed. So it's not a question of fertilizer. It's a question of why the fertilizer effectiveness has not really happened as it was supposed to be. The question comes of soil degradation. The Montpellier panel explained that 65% of arable land, 30% of grazing land, 20% of forest land in Africa are degraded somehow. Serious land degradation accounts for about a quarter of the land area in sub-Saharan Africa, and perhaps as many as 200 million people are living on those lands that are degraded. An increase in risks of degradation by erosion alone between 1980 and the end of the century, maybe 36% in Africa compared with 14% of the world as a whole. Here's an example of some of my own experiments in Nigeria. This land was fertilized, but soil erosion did not respect that activity. It happened anyway. Therefore, when the erosion happens, the loss of soil organic matter content, because it's a light fraction, is the most important major depletion that happens because of erosion. Clay is another component. I monitored loss of soil organic carbon on 1% slope, 417 kilogram per hectare. On 5% slope, more than 2.3 tons per hectare in 1 year. On 10% slope, 3.6 tons. On 15% slope, almost 4 tons of carbon lost by erosion in 1 ton. So erosion, depletion of carbon is very serious issue that need to be addressed. Then I looked at the soil temperature. Soil temperature on a cleared land versus the forest land at 1 centimeter depth, the difference of 50 degrees centigrade versus 30 degrees centigrade. Temperature goes up tremendously by deforestation and plowed bare ridged ground surface or even without ridges. At such a high temperature, volatilization losses are very high. Taking away the crop residue is another issue. These two plots have the same recommended rate of fertilizer, same varieties, same date of planting. The plot in the foreground for 15 years in a row, the residue was removed. The soil biological activity, the soil aggregation, the soil compaction problem is so serious that even when there was no erosion, because we abandoned the plots, the fertilizer was not effective. The crop residue management created soil structure, moisture regime, temperature, which made fertilizer very effective. Therefore, soil biota, if it is ignored, fertilizer use efficiency may not happen. And that brings me the question of why soils are not responsive. 43% of Africa is arid. Moisture is a very serious issue. Low soil water availability. Less than 15% of the rainfall takes the form of transpiration. That is a serious problem of water conservation. High soil temperature. I mentioned to you getting as much as 50 degrees Celsius at 1 centimeter aggravate the drought problem. Crusted and compacted soils that are showed in the previous slide have very low available water holding capacity. Therefore, even if you apply fertilizer, roots cannot absorb it. And the low organic carbon content, a flood type of irrigation, unbalanced nutrient as we know the law of minima. Therefore, the challenges that need to be addressed for fertilizers to be effective: drought. one issue, temperature, soil degradation, various type of soil degradation, ad hoc removal of good land within the urban area, and of course the climate threat. These issues must be addressed so that the soil health is restored, so that the fertilizers are effective. Let me talk about irrigation for a moment. Irrigation can definitely alleviate drought, but only 6% of the area is irrigated. If there's a serious drought problem, there is no water availability, the chances that the fertilizer are effective cannot happen. Let me give you an example. A very good part is that if you look at the grain yield in a dryland, non-irrigated area, it is equal to evapotranspiration time transpiration divided by evapotranspiration time reverse of transpiration time the harvest index. All these factors are water driven, and the fertilizer nutrient affect this equation only through their effect on the water use. And unless that is taken care of, as you notice in all these parameters of the equation, the nutrients appear only indirectly because water becomes the overriding factor. Therefore, the fertilizer and the other management, the equation does not suggest that they are not important. They are not effective until the water requirement is met, until the soil physical environment in the root zone are optimal. If you don't address that, fertilizer is not effective. This equation that I just showed you, it's from Bobby Stewart and other of his colleagues. I published it with him. This equation applies regardless of whether it's a rain-fed or irrigated, grown in arid or humid environment, limited fertility or not fertility, pest management or not, water has to be taken care of. It's all about water. The common thread in all these factors is water. So somewhere, if that is not addressed, we got a problem. Here's another something, a little bit of a physics, what we call water retention characteristics. Here is a soil which has good organic matter content, same soil with low organic matter content. You look at the available water holding capacity of the two soil, considerably different because of the organic matter content. And there are many people who will suggest if you increase organic matter content by 1% in a deficit soil, you can tremendously increase water resources. There are many examples of it. Here, I don't need to go into detail. The last one, just as a reference point, compost can hold 20 times its weight in water, especially in a sandy soil. So how do you alleviate drought? Mulch farming, conservation agriculture with safe irrigation, drip sub-irrigation, solar irrigation system for water irrigation purposes, increasing soil organic carbon content, and improving available water capacity of the soil so that the nutrients are effective. Simply broadcasting nutrient is not a solution. We are using globally 135 kilogram per hectare. In fertilizer in Africa, only 17. We have a long way to go. But before we do that, we want to make sure soil health is restored, improved, managed. Otherwise, fertilizer is a liability. And that part we must understand. So how do you manage soil fertility? That is really the question. Is the soil fertility management, is the soil health management, and then the fertilizer become effective. Yes, soil fertility must be improved. Yes, soil physical and biological constraint must be addressed. Yes, overall soil health must be restored. Yes, organic matter content must be managed. Then, and only then, can fertilizer be effective, not otherwise. That part is very important. We have a very good understanding that we need 2.5 to 3.5% organic matter content in soil. Most soil is less than 0.5% in sub-Saharan Africa. Here is another part. You got soil organic carbon pool, crop yield, unfertilized soil respond this way. The fertilized soil responds very differently, depending upon the organic matter content. The incremental increase, of course, because of the organic carbon decreases with increase. As you reach the optimal level, 3.5 to 4%, maybe the further increase is much less. We know that on a global scale, in a depleted soil, if you increase organic carbon content by 1 ton in the root zone, each crop yield can be improved. And in developing countries such as in Africa, the tremendous increment can be made by improving soil quality through organic matter content management, and then supplemental application of the fertilizer. Regenerative agriculture is part of that equation, because that is the bedrock of sustainable development, which also restores organic carbon content. So my motive is the question of NPK should be CNPK. C comes before NPK. If there is no enough C in soil, NPK will not be effective. The leguminous cover crops, deep-rooted, such as pigeon peas, in some drier part of Eastern Africa, Mucuna, Utilis, in the humid part. There are many other agroforestry systems that we developed with Lucina, Glaricidia, and many other legumes which fix nitrogen are very effective. Therefore, the roadmap that we should be thinking about, which is sometimes ambitious, I know, 17 kilogram, it can be made as much as 30 or 60 kilogram, but make sure soil health is restored. If not, fertilizers are not effective. Irrigation, yes, only 6% now. Definitely we must focus on irrigation. Conservation agriculture as a vehicle to control erosion, moisture regime, temperature regime, very important. Only 1.5 million hectares now. We can go up there. Agroforestry, again, very low now. We can certainly focus on that. So fertilizer is not a package by itself, but fertilizer as a component of the holistic approach is the one which is something we need to consider. One other part which I want to mention, that if the soil health is not improved, not restored, plant health cannot be restored, animal health is not restored, human health affects on that. They are interlinked. Environmental health and the planetary health. They are all together. When we talk about the socioeconomic factors, the food security research in Africa must address environmental, natural resource management in a holistic way. And that is, fertilizer play an important part, but they are a part of the entire package. Otherwise, they're not effective. Last thing I want to mention, famines, which is a serious issue in Africa. I also believe they are man-made tragedies. We must make famine and mass starvation politically intolerable, morally toxic, ethically unthinkable, and humanly unacceptable. In all this, integrated soil fertility management of plant nutrition, integrated soil fertility. That's different than fertilizer management. Fertilizer management is a part, it is a component. Soil health is the key issue. Soil physical properties are critical to soil health and to the effectiveness of fertilizer. And for all of that, activity and species diversity of soil organism is very important. So please consider fertilizer as a component of the holistic management. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you very much, Prof. Lal. That was excellent and very succinct presentation. Very useful. So audience and chair, I think that our chair has arrived, Professor Richard Mkandawire. So I will pass the baton back to him to continue moderating this session. Prof. Richard.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Tom Jane. My apologies. I mean, we had a small blackout, and I'm just joining in. But I listened in to Professor Lal's presentation, and again, he makes a very impassionate plea for us all to begin looking at fertilizer not as a panacea to enhancing agriculture productivity, but we need to look at you know, other components. It's only part of it. And we appreciate, Professor Lar, that you're committed to joining efforts with African institutions in moving us towards this summit and tapping on your many years of experience and research in this particular area, including research in Africa. So we look forward to having further conversations with you as a partner of these African institutions. We're delighted. Without further ado, let me call upon the next panelist, who is Elizabeth Samanda. She is actually an activist on the ground, and very often we are accused that we do not bring on board practitioners on the ground. Elizabeth is, one of those who is not just a farmer herself, but also she has actually, worked on a number of areas linked to fertilizer, but also she's the president of the African Farmers Federation, but also she sits on the African Fertilizer Financing Mechanism, besides sitting on a number of other related organizations on agriculture. So welcome to you, Elizabeth. I would like to tap on your thinking on how farmers across Africa might begin to contribute towards this upcoming summit on the African Fertilizer Summit 2, which is likely to take place maybe 2021 in Ethiopia, Addis Ababa. And I would like to hear from you what you feel would be critical areas of focus going forward, or what are the critical areas which need to be presented by the farmers in terms of how we might actually advance the goal of enhancing agriculture productivity. As we learned, moving beyond fertilizer, what are the views of farmers? Elizabeth?
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Richard, for giving me this opportunity. And thank you to ReNAPRI for inviting PAFO and inviting the farmers to be part of this discussion with the professors and the doctors. It is indeed a great honor. Listening to what Professor Rattan, I hope I've mentioned his name properly, to what he has presented, the different aspects of soil fertility, the soil quality, and all these other issues relating to the temperature, the drought, the irrigation aspects, and so on. They're very critical and very important areas to focus on. But what is so important for us as farmers? I think for us, it is more of how do we move this science from the researchers, from the professors, from the doctors to the farm. Whatever equations that he was presenting, for example, on the water equation, to my grandmother, to my parents, and to myself, who is on the farm, they are very important and critical, but might not look very, very important for us. And what we feel is more important and relevant to the farmers is on how does a farmer access the right fertilizer, for example. What is the requirements for the fertilizer application? What quantities does this farmer need? What quality does the farmer need? What is the type of, based on the type of the soil that this farmer has, what is the right fertilizer? And again, what is the right seed? For the farmer, those are the most critical things that they need. And again, driving and moving along the entire production chain, right from the farm to the fork. So 14 years since the Abuja II summit, the fertilizer consumption in most African countries still remains small, with an average, I think he mentioned 17%, but some records say 12, others say 17. So I'm not going to be very certain on the exact consumption ratios, but at least less than 17 kilograms per hectare. So while in some countries, the fertilizer usage, like in Uganda, where I come from, is as low as 3 kilograms per hectare, or even less than that in some areas. And when you compare this to the world average consumption of more than 140 kilometers per hectare, you realize that we still have a long way to go as African farmers, as African researchers, as African actors in the fertilizer value chain. We need to see and we need to identify those critical areas and those middle missing initiatives that have to be put in place to make sure that we drive the fertilizer agenda from right at the inception of the Abuja I to when we move to Abuja II and when we achieve the target of the 50 kilograms per hectare. So Africa fertilizer consumption trend, much as yes, it is still low, but it is steadily growing. But we know that this is highly private sector led with minimal efforts by our governments. Yes, our governments signed or adhered to the Abuja I, but when you look at what they've put in place, the infrastructure itself they've put in place, it is still lacking. And when you look at the resolution 1 of the Abuja I summit, it was to increase fertilizer consumption in Africa. And then this would be done, of course, through a financing mechanism that would be put together by the African Union and the Africa Development Bank. Yes, the mechanism is in place, the Africa Fertilizer Financing Mechanism. But it might be a very shocking news to the listeners that true, since 2006, the mechanism started operational, I think around 2010. And it's now 2 countries that have contributed to the fund, to this fund, Nigeria and Tanzania. So FFM is currently running credit guarantees or the pilot programs in those 2 countries in partnership with AFAP. But for us, the biggest hindrance from what we see to the fertilizer usage, especially to the farmers who are the main consumers of this fertilizer, is the cost of the fertilizer itself, which is high and does not commensurate with the cost of the agricultural output products. It doesn't make sense for a farmer to buy fertilizer at a high price, and at the end, after producing, the produce does not have market. So a farmer ends up, spending a lot on fertilizer, but when actually they don't get an equivalent in terms of the output. And this is mainly due to the taxes, due to the tariffs on the fertilizer and its raw materials. When it comes to the cost of transportation and distribution, it ends up shooting the fertilizer prices so high. We don't have a structured distribution mechanism. Yes, the private sector, AFAP, they're trying to put together the different hubs, the distribution hubs, and they are pretty working very well. And also in some other cases, the farmer cooperatives, farmers associations, and so on are working pretty very well. But it is still lacking. We need to have government support of such initiatives. And because most African countries are liberal market economies, farmers are also overexploited because there are no set standards or minimum prices for fertilizer. There's need for governments to subsidize fertilizer for farmers, but also to prioritize accessibility of fertilizer by the less privileged genders. And by this, I mean the women and the youth who are mainly the users of the fertilizer. When it comes to the regulatory framework, in regard to the movement of fertilizer across the region and within countries, it needs to be harmonized. Recently, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area was launched. But if we don't have a harmonized policy framework that is going to allow the free movement of fertilizer from one region, from one country to another, if we are still having borders and governments that can wake up today morning and say, I don't want this truck in my country, I don't want these products to cross to my country, then we still have a long way to go. And this has all resulted, because there's no harmonization of such policies, it has resulted into counterfeits on the market. Since most countries don't have the capacity of quality control, several farmers have been disappointed with substandard products on the market. And there's also a need to have a structured mechanism of distribution, like I mentioned, through the farmer groups, through the hub networks, but also more importantly, the capacity building of farmers through their associations, to understand services like soil testing before fertilizer application, the proper fertilizer application, and the usage of fertilizer, like what Professor Rattan was explaining. I mean, putting it in simpler terms for the farmers to clearly understand it. So what do we see, or what should be put in place to move as we move to Abuja II? I don't know if I still have time, but I'm going to try to summarize this. So from our side, we see that the road to Abuja II is a bit turbulent as we speak. And I'm not sure if we have any lessons to date from Abuja I that we would like to revitalize the entire process. Yes, from Abuja I, 2006, after the signing and governments committing, to increase fertilizer usage to 50 kilograms per hectare. To date, it is 2020, 14 years down the road, but we are still at 17, not even halfway. So I don't know if there are any good lessons to pick from there, or we could use those lessons on why we are not yet there to revitalize the entire process. So in this, from us, we feel fertilizer should not be a standalone issue. We need a holistic approach of addressing all the issues affecting farmers, and not only looking at fertilizer as a standalone, but we need an inclusive approach of focusing at the entire value chain from farm to the fork. And this should be very key. If we are to make big strides in fertilizer usage, we need a platform where all actors equally play an important role in transforming the food system. And in this, we need to pay special attention to the public-private sector partnerships. Yes, the private sector has moved a step further, and I think there are good lessons that we can pick to inform the public initiatives. There is also need for a harmonized continental fertilizer policy and regulation. That would eliminate taxes and tariffs. We know that, for example, 2/3 of African countries don't have coherent fertilizer policies. But also, these will contribute to creating harmonized regional and continental markets, hence making fertilizer available and accessible, but mostly affordable for the farmers. We need to profile the different government subsidy programs. I know there are a lot happening out there. Nigeria has moved a little further. Uganda is also implementing the agricultural cluster development program where they're giving fertilizer subsidy to farmers. So we need to profile some of those initiatives and programs and look at where they are doing or where they are working better and where there are shortfalls so that we can work along those shortfalls. Then we also need to focus on supporting and strengthening farmer-led approaches and initiatives that have proven successful in fertilizer access and distribution. We need to develop a fundraising mechanism on how to increase and support the Africa fertilizer financing mechanism to allow increased fertilizer financing and credit guarantees and at local and continental level. As we speak now, the current partners, I think, are Africa Development Bank. Then we have government of Nigeria and also government of Tanzania. So we need to see many, many African governments coming on board to put resources to this financing mechanism channel, so that now it could also support, the fertilizer value chain in Africa. And lastly, we need to invest in up-to-date and real-time data. And this should happen at all levels of the fertilizer value chain. We need to understand, for example, this average fertilizer consumption. Where is it? Because you realize that some countries, for example, have gone further, but other countries are still lagging behind. So we need to have real-time data in terms of the countries, the areas that are doing better, and those that are not yet there, so that we can always work around to improve the entire, fertilizer usage. With that, I beg to submit, and over to you, Professor Richard. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth. I think you raised great research questions and very important issues that need to be taken to Abuja II summit. And I'm sure my research colleagues have taken note of those important questions, including the fundamental question on why do we have limited numbers of fertilizer SMEs in Africa compared to seed companies? A very important question. And also the question of the need for building and strengthening fertilizer networks. Again, that again speaks to financing SMEs in the fertilizer value chains. But also, I think more fundamentally, the question you're raising around the need for ensuring that we have a regional fertilizer policy frameworks, and indeed continental frameworks. How can that be done? And again, I believe a think tank like ReNAPRI should be able to provide some answers to that, particularly as we proceed to move on to the Abuja II Fertilizer Summit. So Elizabeth, much appreciated for your contributions as somebody on the ground. But more fundamentally, I think we're being reminded that as we raise these research questions, we need to make sure that those research questions are raised by those who are on the ground, people like Elizabeth, who are working as farmers on the ground. So we truly, I think, appreciate your contribution. We can now move on to, again, another research luminary, Professor Pedro Sanchez. I believe Professor Pedro Sanchez, a well-known figure across Africa, is not only, one of the few World Food Prize laureates along the lines of, Professor Lar, but also he's a great friend of Africa. He is actually famous for establishing these millennium villages across Southern and East Africa. And he has even a farm, I believe, in Kenya. And we truly appreciate that he is actually one Africanist that remains passionate in support of how we might enhance agriculture productivity. So we'd like to hear from you, Pedro, on some of your work and also what you see as key recommendations that could go to this next summit. What is new that we can take along to the summit on fertilizer next year? Pedro?
Thank you, Professor Mkandawire. I need to start my video, and the host has stopped the video, so I would like the host to allow me to have a video. Okay, looks like I'm on the video. So, so thank you, folks. Actually, Professor Rattan Lal and I met at a meeting in Ibadan, Nigeria in 1962. And we both have been working very much focused on Africa and the tropics ever since. I was also present at Abuja I in 2006 in Abuja. And many of us were so happy to have fertilizers being talked about and made a priority. We felt this was something that many of us have been working about. And the reason is very simple. Crops need additional nutrients in just about every case that are higher than the soil itself can provide by mineralization and other process. That's why we need fertilizers. And also we take a lot of harvests out and a lot of nutrients out with the harvest, and we must return them back to the soil, which in most cases, organic inputs that can add it are not sufficient, and that's why we need fertilizer. However, even though Abuja I has been criticized for many things, I am always very much an optimist, and seeing the double of fertilizer use in Africa in the last 15 years or so, from 8 to 17 kilograms of NPK per hectare. That's progress. But I have also seen, and seen it reported in FAO data, that at least a couple of countries, Malawi and Zimbabwe, have reached the goal of Abuja I of 50 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, meaning that there can be policies and ways to do that. I'm not sure about other countries, but at least these two have. Still, that's not enough, because what we're seeing in Southeast Asia is an average use of 75 kilograms of NPK per hectare, which is a very gross thing. But anyway, we have to get from the current 17 to about 75 in the next decade if we're going to do something important. Professor Lau has talked brilliantly about the need for soil conservation, soil health, regenerative agriculture, the need to prevent erosion, and so on. I would like to propose that, wholeheartedly agreeing with all that, wholeheartedly with my heart, because these things are so important. You cannot afford the soil to erode. Most farmers know that. And then there are some situations where compaction takes place and makes even infiltration out. But we have to, it's not a common use throughout Africa. Very much of this depends on soil texture, mineralogy, and other causes. And African soils are very, very variable, I'm sorry, from the best to the worst that I've seen in my life. So we need a holistic approach. Abuja II should not be about fertilizer only. It should be about the whole set of practices that will make, yes, indeed, fertilizer. If we want to go, let's go to the Southeast Asian goal of 73 kilos of NPK. But it's more than that. There's such a thing. The carbon doesn't come from fertilizer. Fertilizers have no carbon at all. The carbon have to come from organic inputs. And this is something that is not in a fertility depleted soil, which is one of the parts of soil degradation that Professor Lau mentioned. You cannot grow organic inputs if you don't have enough fertility to grow the proper pastures for cows to produce manure. And in some cases, the manure is so low in nitrogen that it actually immobilizes nitrogen, takes nitrogen away from the soil when applied, as opposed to releasing it. This is well done in sandy soils of Zimbabwe, very well documented by scientists for many years. So what I am going to propose that in addition to the soil health issues and soil conservation issues and management, there's another just as important issue that Abuja II should take care of, and that's crop germplasm, high yielding seeds that are developed or are developing. Some of them more adapted to the changed climates that we already have. Without proper seeds, forget about using fertilizers. Nothing is not going to happen either. So something totally a part of the soil area but essential to it is high yielding seeds, hybrid maize, GMOs in many cases, as countries are slowly going this way when they produce something special, such as tolerance to insects, and that will guarantee your yields. And we can see in the crop yielding area there is quite a bit of advantage, but quite a bit of advances, but they have taken place in about 14 or 15 countries that have been the source of a lot of innovation, a lot of funds, and so on. There's the rest of sub-Saharan Africa there. And my friend Joe DeVries, formerly from AGRA and the Rockefeller Foundation, plant breeder, now is working with the next group of countries that are neglected. I'm not talking about Nigeria or Ethiopia or Zambia. I'm talking about Congo Republic, Benin, and many others, and start focusing on developing the solution to the whole business of germplasm is to have seed production systems that work. And many of them, thankfully now, are run by African indigenous businessmen. Actually, most of them women who are making money out of producing good seed and selling it to the farmers. So my first point, in addition to what Professor Lal has said, is you gotta have high yielding seed, or else it's frankly stupid to add fertilizers or to do organic inputs or any of that stuff if your seed is not going to respond. A high yielding seed in African terms, I'm talking corn going from 1 metric tons per hectare, which was the average corn yield in Africa at the start of this century, in the year 2000, going to 3 tons per hectare. And I've seen fields in Malawi where you see the 1 ton per hectare crop growing, and you see the 3 ton per hectare crop growing. The 3 ton per hectare crop is actually tripling the amount of water, soil moisture, no irrigation, that goes through the crop, and that increases crop yields instead of wasting it as soil evaporation. So it has a lot to do. Let's remember, however important irrigation is, and we should have it whenever we can, but most of the soil supply of water doesn't come from irrigation. It comes from the soil moisture that is there basically by rainfall. And we should remember that it's at least 60 to 70% of the total water that is consumed by crops. So I'm saying 3 things. I would like to propose 3 concrete actions of Abuja II in terms of what is in the conferences and going in terms of what should be done. First, increase the yield of mineral fertilizers in an effective way. That means you're gonna have, we know that nitrogen and phosphorus are almost everywhere deficient, but there are a lot of African soils that do not respond to potassium. They have enough potassium there, they're very happy. And there are many African soils that are depleted in sulfur and zinc, 2 key nutrients. So in addition to the C, N, NPK, I would like to add S, and I would like to add zinc, but that's site specific. And therefore you need to be able to diagnose those. And now, for the first time in history, Africa has a complete digital soil map produced by many institutions throughout the last 15 years. And now we have something that Asia, Latin America, North America doesn't have, a complete soil map that can help you in the management of soils, and also in determining fertilizer application needs and timing and so on. So we can't forget about sulfur in many areas. We can't forget about zinc in other areas, and that have to be marked. And we can forget about potassium in many areas. So making it happen. Having and the measure for that is agricultural efficiency, not nutrient use response, agricultural efficiency. And that means the kilograms of, let's say, maize minus with fertilizer minus the kilograms without fertilizers divided by the fertilizer. That's totally different from nutrient use efficiency, which is what people use and assume that all the yield of a crop is because of fertilizer, which is of course not true. There's a lot of nutrients that go into the soil that are already there, or added as biological nitrogen fixation that have not nothing to do with fertilizers. So organic inputs. Okay, that's where the carbon comes from. And it's hard to do because the concentrations of nutrients are low, but of course the concentrations of carbon are high, roughly 50% carbon. So the first thing to do there is to recycle crop residues. The problem with incorporating crop residues in Africa is that a lot of it needs to be done to feed the animals. But if you go from 1 to 3 tons per hectare, you will have enough there to feed the animals as well as feed the soil. That is the main carbon inputs. Of course, whatever other inputs you can have through crop rotations with legumes or applications of manures, the right kind of manure grown on good fertility soils, again, because if not, they would immobilize the nitrogen. That needs to be done. So the carbon responsibility is there. It's as important as mineral fertilizers and is as important as seed. And those are the three components I want to emphasize in terms of technology, in addition to what Professor Lau has said on the maintenance of soil physical properties and biological properties, which I'm totally in agreement. Now, those are the 3 things, but I want to say technical things. Soil organic matter content is totally dependent on texture. So there's no way you can raise significant amounts of organic matter in sandy soils in a hot environment. They will decompose. The inputs will decompose rapidly. So I don't go for a specific carbon number, but or at least if you're going to do that, do it for soils that have different textures and mineralogy. Sandy soils cannot increase much of their carbon contents, while clay soils and loamy soils can. This is sort of a genetical part of soils due to texture and mineralogy. So again, I have 3 biophysical imperatives. The first one is very good germplasm seed companies there to produce it, mineral fertilizers and organic inputs. Then on training, I want to say something that I think is usually bypassed. We always talk about capacity building in Africa for scientists and practitioners. But you know what? There is a lot of capacity there already built. But what those people, extension agents, farmers, well, let's say extension agents, researchers, and so on, lack is funds, operational funds to do their job. I'm not talking about their salaries. I'm talking about the need for a motorcycle or a pickup truck and be able to pay for the petrol that you need, the need for computer with broadbands, the need for being totally integrated with the rest of the world scientific community, like ReNAPRI is doing in policy. I would like to see that in having agronomists and other people who would have the wherewithal to attend international meetings. We're not going to do Zoom forever. We need to look at different places as we travel. We need funds, operational funds, that many of our best scientists, best trained scientists in Africa don't have. So they're limited by what they can do because of that. So another main policy issue is we have to reduce fertilizer costs, especially at the last mile. As fertilizers are most expensive in Africa, even though they're very profitable, they're most expensive. So, this is clear to me on the policy side. So I see Abuja II as call it fertilizer summit or soil health summit better, but to include the key components of good soil conservation and management, as Professor Lau has said, but also seed, high yielding seed, which is essential to get increased production. And the other essential input are the organic inputs to provide carbon to the soil that fertilizers cannot do because they don't have any. So these are the 3 main things. And my two main policy things, and I'm a soil scientist, what I like to say is let's figure out how our well-trained scientists and technicians in Africa can get enough operational funds to do their job. A pickup truck is needed. If it's needed, it's needed. And I'm not talking only about the agronomists. Policy researchers also need a pickup truck to do the survey. So get all the wherewithal, the operational costs. I'm not talking about salaries again, too. And then using the new tools like the digital soil map of Africa, thank goodness. It started in 2006. I was the first principal investigator from the Gates Foundation, funded by the Gates Foundation to do that. But now that had passed through several institutions on several hands, and it's very exciting. So we hope that Africa II will help us not only continue rising the fertilizer needs for high yielding crops, but all the other aspects that are essential. We need to know more, for example, about non-responsive soils from fertilizers. Some of the reasons sometimes are obvious. You're not applying the right fertilizer. A sulfur deficient soil will not respond to NPK fertilizers because it has no sulfur there. So there are a lot of things like that, a lot of things that we soil scientists, agronomists, very much together with the policy people can make Africa to go from the average of crops of 1 ton per hectare at the beginning of the century in the year 2000 to the goal of at least 3 tons per hectare that we can accomplish in the next few years. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Pedro, indeed for your very passionate commitment to this process on moving beyond Abuja I Fertilizer Summit. I remember you with Jeff Sachs, very, with your compassionate plea in Abuja.
Oh yeah.
The need for
Abuja was a lot of things, a lot of fun too.
Absolutely. But we're delighted that, you want this conversation to be broadened, to move just beyond fertilizer, input, but also to look at other components, just like Professor Lara was saying, including attention to high-yielding seed varieties to be part of the conversation, but also training, organic matter, and all those issues to be part of the discussions moving forward. But I must say this, and this is important, because as we speak to our partners, it's very important that we need passionate colleagues from across the globe that are passionate about advancing the agenda of enhancing agricultural productivity in Africa. And I would like to join hands with you. That's why ReNAPRI is here to look to partners like yourselves who are global luminaries in science, but also in understanding some of the challenges of smallholder farmers on the ground. And we're delighted that you'll be able to join us on to the next summit, on the road to the next summit.
Absolutely, Richard. Absolutely, Richard. I'm with you. I'm only 80 years old. So looking at Borlaug before, I have a bunch of years before me in which I can contribute to Africa.
Absolutely. We look forward to that. I would like to move on to another global partner, and this is actually IFDC, Rob Groot, who is the regional West African director for West Africa. Rob has been with us in Africa for many, many years. I must also say that Rob is actually a farmer. He told me one time that he grows onions in Mali, and clearly he has also soiled his hands. So he understands fully some of the challenges of smallholder farmer productivity, beside being a scientist, and would welcome Rob's perspectives on how FDC might actually join hands with ReNAPRI and other African institutions in persuading African governments to really appreciate that there's more to it than just fertilizer, because IFDC also is working in that space, moving beyond fertilizer. They also touch on issues around policy as well, but more fundamentally, something which, Pedro spoke to, about also supporting African institutions. How do we work hand in hand with African institutions in ensuring that we support this agenda beyond just fertilizer, but looking at some of the challenges that African governments are facing or smallholder farmers are facing, which is not just fertilizer, but also other areas. So Pedro, Rob, over to you.
Richard, I'm there. I think that the host hasn't started the video for me. I can't control that. So I ask your people to do that. Start my video. It can be done right now. Yes, I'm there. Thank you, Richard. It's true. I got to know my wife in Mali half a century ago or so. And indeed, we were involved in onion farming. It started a long time ago. You already said, Richard, I'm working for the International Fertilizers Development Center. I'm actually based in Togo. And Pedro and Professor Lau, when you first met in 1962, I was just 4. So I'm a little bit junior when it comes to this experience. Professor Lau, who recently joined the board of directors of IFDC, already explained why we didn't reach the 50 kilograms target that was set in Abuja. And he explained more or less why we are only at 17 or 18 kgs per hectare. And Richard, you asked me to explain what has been achieved since the Fertilizer Summit in 2006. And although we didn't reach this target, a lot has happened. So I wanna focus on a couple of issues. The first one is the industry. The industry really took responsibility since Abuja. People say, why did it take so long? Building a fertilizer industry is a 5-year process. So it took a couple of years to do the thinking, then the investment had to be done. But currently you see that Nigeria has become a major urea producer, 3 major producers. Production capacity of urea in Nigeria will expand to 4 million tons per year. That exceeds the demand of Nigeria. It even exceeds the sub-Saharan Africa demand. We can look at Morocco. It expanded the phosphate production capacity largely for the African market. Not only the traditional DAP, but very much balanced crop nutrition. And I will say a couple of words more. Ethiopia is investing in fertilizer production. There are several laudable initiatives to develop local mineral deposits. I think of Congo, I think of Angola. Good to know that the African Development Bank has been behind this as the major financier for these investments. And there is much more in the pipeline. And all this is done with the idea that the African fertilizer market will grow. What is interesting to see is that in West Africa, the fertilizer industry is really joining forces. The West Africa Fertilizer Association was created, and 90% of the fertilizer industry is associated in this association, which is not only a powerful lobby, but it's not only a powerful lobby and advocacy body, but it's also a place for joint procurement. You will all remember that at Abuja, there was a pledge for joint procurement. Governments didn't succeed to get that going. We don't regret that. But now we see that the private sector is taking this up instead of the governments. And one of the things I think we all know, donors and governments supported a lot of work on agro-dealer development. Elizabeth is very well aware of it. It reduced travel distances between the farm and the agro-dealers, making access to fertilizers a lot easier for the farmers. So that's the first thing, the industry. Secondly, we see that governments have taken ownership. And it's not only national governments, it's also regional governments. We see that ECOWAS and COMESA are actively working on fertilizer policy harmonization, something which is very much needed to accelerate the fertilizer trade and cross-border movements. A good example also is that, I think it was last week, the ECOWAS Bank for Investment and Development entered into a $520 million credit guarantee deal with its West Africa Fertilizer Association. This will facilitate fertilizer trade because it provides, more access to trade credit. It's a major achievement. Then we see that the national governments have supported the investments by the industry. Think of Nigeria, think of Ethiopia, think of Ghana, where plans are being made. Think of Kenya. There is much more to mention. And then we see that in several countries, governments played an active role in supporting what we call national fertilizer platforms. We've seen it in Mozambique. We've seen it in Kenya. We see it now happening in Ghana. And the role of the government there, it's undeniable. It's important. And then in many countries, and we heard Pedro talking about it and Professor Lau, balanced crop nutrition, government has supported it through research, but even in subsidy programs. Then there is a third issue after the role of the private sector and the government. That's the change we've seen from fertilizers for only cash crops to fertilizers for food crops. And very few people realize it. Before the summit in 2006, most of the fertilizers went to cash crops, to cotton, to palm oil, to tea, to tobacco, to sugarcane, to cocoa. When you look at the growth that we've seen in the last decade, it's been in the food crop sector. I think Ethiopia is the leading example. It has become the biggest fertilizer market in Africa, mainly through good government interventions. But all the fertilizer in Ethiopia is for food crops. Another great example is Mali. And there Pedro already talked about increasing productivity. What we have seen in Mali is amazing. In Mali, there has been a tremendous increase in fertilizer consumption, but most of it went to rice and to maize. And we see that in Mali, the average maize yield in the last decade increased from 800 kilograms per hectare to 2.2 tons. And that in just 10 years. A large part of it can be attributed to fertilizer use. And then the final issue, there has been a lot of progress in agronomy, in soil science. In the past, and I think we all know it, the main fertilizers that were used were urea, DAP, sometimes NPKs, and we know that these are often not the right fertilizers for the right conditions. And it's good to see that a lot of research has gone into what we call balanced crop nutrition. Pedro, you already referred to it. When crops are provided with the right fertilizers, which is NPKs plus micronutrients, zinc, sulfur, boron, you can get much higher yields from the same amount of fertilizer. Again, I want to refer to Ethiopia, a 180-degree shift, a DAP plus urea country, completely moving away to balanced crop nutrition. We see the same happening in Nigeria. We see it happening in other countries as well. And this is another example of a good collaboration between the demand in country and the responses by the industry. The majority of the major producers are currently looking at possibilities to respond to this demand. And it's really fascinating because we see that the kilograms per hectare may not have dramatically increased, but the efficiency has. The same amount of fertilizer produces more food. And then, well, it has been said, definitely by Professor Lau, there is still not enough attention for soil health in terms of organic matter, carbon sequestration, climate change. And it's definitely something that has to be included in the next fertilizer summit. Then you asked me to say a word about partnerships, Richard. When we see that there are several countries that have reached the 50 kg per hectare target, and Richard, you mentioned Zimbabwe and Malawi. I think Kenya, Ethiopia, Mali, they're also among these, but it's just a handful. But when you see what has happened in these countries, it's not the industry alone, it's not government alone, it's not research, it's not implementation partners like IFDC. It's the partnership between those actors. And what has happened in these countries can serve as examples. And we also know that without these type of partnerships, you will not be able to get there. It's partnering between farmers, between industry, governments, private sector, national research. And that can be the example for, well, part of the way forward. There is a need for a broader agenda to enhance African productivity. So we think that we can expand the successes we've seen the last 10 years in other countries. We can expand it to a broader range of countries. And what is needed is national plans and regional supports. We think that in the next 10 years, all African countries will move to balanced crop nutrition. But you need well-functioning markets. You need governments that understand the importance of smart subsidies. Pedro was talking about the importance of increasing yields. Professor Lal was talking about soil health, carbon sequestration, organo-mineral fertilizer, mitigation climate change, fighting soil degradation. Combine it with what Pedro said, high-yielding seeds. I think you've got the elements of good plans. One thing that cannot be repeated enough is that carbon sequestration or increasing soil organic matter content, it requires fertilizer. You need to produce organic matter, and to produce organic matter, you need inputs. And once organic matter content in the soil has increased, you can make fertilizers much more efficient. I'm almost there, Richard. One final statement. In Europe, up to a certain extent, also in the US, people are talking about the Green Deal, agroecological zero input farming systems. And I hope that Professor Lau and Pedro Sanchez will agree with me that these ideas, up to a large extent, are nonsense for Africa. We need to build soil health from scratch in many situations. It's good that we're preparing the next Africa Fertilizer Summit. It will be Abuja and Addis, interesting. And Richard, we know that ReNAPRI and IFDC, we are both deeply involved. We think that this can lead to a realistic action plan for soil health, to increase food and nutrition security. And I think we can double, probably even triple food production by 2050 if we do it the right way. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, audience.
Yeah, no, thank you, Rob. Thank you. Thank you indeed also to your president for your commitment in working with African institutions. I think you raised a very important point here, which I would like to bring to the attention of my ReNAPRI colleagues in terms of how do you really begin to consolidate these partnerships? Because as researchers, I think very often we assume that we can actually work on our own and in our laboratories or in our own offices without actually looking at how our work can be supported by a range of partners, including the private sector, including civil society organizations. We have Elizabeth here from the Farmers Organization. We have regional economic communities, and indeed, these other associations like the West African Fertilizer Association. What we often forget is that it is these institutions that amplify our voices and provide additional legitimacy to our work. So I'm delighted that you raised that point, and I think it might be important that, going forward, we find ways of consolidating conversations with these partners coming on board. And I'm sure my colleagues would actually take this forward. I know that our time is not with us. You raised a lot of very important issues, which I'm sure our colleagues in ReNAPRI have taken a record of, and we'll be following up on those ones. I would like now to turn to my African colleagues representing various African institutions, and again, to amplify the need for African institutions in partnering with our global institutions so that we have a coalition of the willing, or speaking to one voice, as one voice. Global voices are important, and global knowledge is also important. So I think let's turn to our African colleagues and hear their work and also their perspectives on how do we really jointly with our global partners take this process forward to the African leaders. And I'd like to call upon now Shami Zigore, who is Director of Research and Development at the African Plant Nutrition Institute. He himself has worked not just in the soil nutrition area, micronutrients, but more also broadly. He has also worked with the private sector, but also with a range of other African institutions, besides now working with these other global institutions as well as continental institutions. So Shami, over to you.
Professor, we would have loved to have Shami with us. Unfortunately, he's not able to make it. And so you might have to ask them. panelists. Yes, thank you.
Okay, no, wonderful. Let me then turn over to Hambulo Ngoma, who is a research fellow at IAPRI, which is based in Zambia, one of the research institutes under the umbrella of ReNAPRI. If Hambulo also can speak and respond, I think, to these range of global partners who are committed to working with ReNAPRI and working with African institutions, but also maybe Hambulo, you can also speak to how ReNAPRI intends to work in support of regional economic communities. And indeed, some of the regional platforms, there are also national platforms, which Rob spoke to. How can we move towards this? But also beyond that, perhaps speak to some of the key issues around policy that we could table going to Abuja II Fertilizer Summit. Hambulo?
Thank you, Professor Mkandawire. I think my video is on. Thank you for the opportunity to share our thoughts. I'm wearing two hats today. On one hand, yes, I'm research fellow at the Indian Agriculture Policy Research Institute. I'm also here representing the regional network of Agriculture Policy Research Institutes. It's always a pleasure for me to be on such panels and to stand on the shoulders of giants in the fields. Professor Rattan, Professor Pedro Sanchez, Professor Rob Groot, Madam Elizabeth is speaking about the voices of the farmers. I think they've highlighted a lot of the salient issues insofar as the road to Abuja II is concerned. Now, let me just summarize probably put across some reasons, probably 4 reasons why we need this Abuja II even more now, I think Professor Lau and Professor Sanchez alluded to some of these things that I'm going to mention, but very quickly, I think we all know that projections suggest that by 2050, 25% of the world population will be in sub-Saharan Africa. And think about the implications on food systems. Actually, that demographic transition in Africa might actually either be a disaster or a dividend. Second, the demand for food is projected, especially for cereals, is projected to rise by over 300% by 2050. Third, we've heard that productivity in our region, in Africa, is among the lowest, and various reasons have been advanced. This then leads us to having a lot of large yield gaps. And also lastly, we heard climate change disproportionately tends to affect the smallholder farmers in the region a lot more. So then the big question really is, and also in line with the theme of the conference, the question then is, how can African agriculture be reset and transformed in order to sustainably raise productivity and build resilience in smallholder farming systems? I think we had very excellent interventions from people that have spoken before me. I'm not going to repeat those, but also just to reiterate that for Abuja II, so far the discussions are centering around an aim of, bringing together high-level stakeholders, including African heads of state, the private sector, senior policymakers, and high-ranking government officials to highlight the crucial role of fertilizer and soil health in stimulating productivity growth in African agriculture. So the question is, how can we then stimulate this sustainable productivity growth in Africa? I think we heard from the previous speakers on how best we can make strides as a continent. And also Rob, I think, spoke to some of the achievements that have been done so far. I want to limit my intervention to climate smart agriculture. I think we heard Professor Lau mention that the increasing uptake of conservation agriculture is one of the things needed on the continent. And I want to broaden that to speak more broadly about climate smart agriculture. And think about climate smart agriculture in this context as any suite of agricultural technologies, practices, or policies that aim to raise agriculture productivity and incomes, household incomes, enhance climate change adaptation and resilience, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. The upshot for us in Africa is that in most countries, climate smart agriculture, like conservation agriculture, is actually part of national policy. So already we have a platform on which we can build on. So the question really becomes, how do we then actualize this sustainable agriculture productivity growth in the region? And also, how do we then improve soil health? So in the context of climate smart agriculture, I want to propose two issues. And the first issue is, I think, a need to build institutions and supportive policy environments that will then facilitate appropriate CSA policies where these are lacking, and fast track implementation where policies exist but are not implemented. I think in Africa, in most of Africa, you know, we tend to have very good policies that never seem to be implemented. So perhaps now it's a time for us to see how, as a regional policy think tank, we can influence movement towards implementation of such policies. Perhaps it's also time to think about harmonizing some of these CSA policies at regional level to ensure that farmers get similar messages across the entire region. Finance has been talked about. Financing is very important in order to scale up and also to scale out proven climate smart agriculture interventions, and also a whole range of complementary inputs and activities that Professor Rao and Professor Pedro Sanchez spoke about, including organic fertilizers, hybrid seeds, mechanization, soil testing, irrigation, and organic manure. In this regard, I feel we need more spatially disaggregated evidence on what works where and under what conditions, and on barriers to the adoption of CSA and how these barriers can be addressed so that these proven practices can be scaled out. I think we heard one of the comments that came up in the chat was that the adoption of some of these practices has been low. The second point I want to put across in terms of how we can actualize sustainable agricultural productivity growth in Africa is probably a need to fast track seed and fertilizer harmonization in regional economic commissions. I think we had a passionate plea from Elizabeth representing the farmers. Thank you for that very powerful intervention on the need to harmonize seed and fertilizer policies and regulations in the region. The good part is that there's some progress already, especially on seed, harmonization of seed policies and regulations, especially in COMESA, under the COMESA Seed Harmonization Implementation Plan. So as ReNAPRI, we are hoping that we can engage with these regional economic commissions, COMESA, this part of Africa, and also other RECs in the different regions of Africa. We also feel that there's more work needed on fertilizer policy and regulatory harmonization to assure fertilizer standards, also to lower costs of fertilizers, also to increase the use of balanced fertilizers, and also to ensure that fertilizer recommendations are specific to given areas. I was actually very pleased to learn from Professor Pedro Sanchez that now there is a soil map for Africa. I can't wait to get my hands on that map and see how best, as a regional network of policy think tanks, we can use that map to help national governments better design their extension systems and also better prioritize their investments in research and development. And we think that also the coming on board of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area might help in harmonizing some of these policies that are very key in improving our agricultural productivity in the region. We feel that now is not the time to implement inward-looking, stringent policies that stifle trade and integration. I think Professor Rao in his interventions earlier on mentioned that 20% of the arable land in the world is in Africa, but then we utilize only about 2% of the inorganic fertilizers that are used in the entire world. I think if we want to move ahead, we have to see how best we can address those barriers to, first of all, access to fertilizers. Secondly, barriers that limit the responsiveness of crops to fertilizers. And I think Professor Pedro Sanchez and Professor Lau mentioned specifically how that can happen. So as the regional think tank, ReNAPRI, we are ready to partner with the IFDC. We are already in conversations with them and work with them very closely in putting together preparatory works towards Abuja II and all the other partners. And indeed, we would also like to use this platform to get back to some of these regulatory frameworks that have been started in different regional economic commissions to see how we can help push the agenda forward. In the interest of time, Professor Mkandawire, I think I'll end my interventions here. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you for the opportunity for ReNAPRI to offer some remarks on this very important platform. Over to you, sir.
Right. No, thank you very much, Hambulo, for this complimentary contribution to this conversation, particularly on your focus and emphasis on the need for looking at the harmonization of seed and fertilizer policies at the regional level, and also, the need for looking into climate smart agriculture as another important dimension to the Abuja conversation. But I think an important point also you raise is the need for maybe setting up these national regulatory policy frameworks, including laws, because one of the greatest challenges is that we have a flood of global fertilizer companies looking for markets in Africa, and many countries are not able to regulate that flood of fertilizer coming into Africa, and indeed without a proper regulatory framework at the national level, there's a danger of very poor quality fertilizers dominating the African market, particularly for uninformed maybe smallholder farmers who may not understand what is in there. We've seen that in the seed sector, where fake seeds which are not certified are thrown out there to smallholder farmers. So you raised those, I think, extremely important questions. But I think an important question, which seems to be arising here, and I think anybody can actually respond to that, is around how do we ensure that the policies which have been very well articulated by research institutions like ReNAPRI, and indeed IFDC, and our various universities, including our partners from northern institutions, are not taken up by these African governments. How do we make sure that these are implemented? Most of these government officials are not ignorant of good policies. They're fully aware what good policies look like, but somehow they're not taken up. What can we do? How do we persuade at the next summit that the policies which have been generated by African institutions are implemented? Anybody who can respond to that question? Hambulo, maybe you can start with responding to that question, since you raised this question, lack of implementation of these policies.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor Mkandawire. That's the elephant in the room. In most countries in Africa, you find the very good pieces of legislation and policies and strategies, but they never seem to see the light of day. So I think one of the probably practical ways we can try to ensure that these policies are implemented is to ensure that we use a very robust policy engagement system, where the problems that the policies are aiming to address are well articulated, and we ensure that the politicians, as it were, the policy implementers, if you like, are well informed and do know that if such policies are not implemented, what are the costs? What does that imply for particular countries, and within countries, what are the implications at subnational level? I think if we start off from that perspective where our policy engagement is very broad-based and inclusive, I think we might score some successes. But you know, the other issue with policy, influencing policy change, is that it kind of moves from the domain of economics or development per se to politics, as it were. And in that respect, it becomes very difficult. Then you have to think about who are the champions in the particular national governments, and how do you reach out to them to ensure that whatever policies that you are trying to influence, you know, can be communicated to the powers that be, like who holds the powers to change particular policies. So as think tanks, we need to identify these champions in national governments and ensure that we engage with them to a very great detail and a very great extent for them to understand where we're coming from and to understand the trade-offs and synergies. I think Professor Tom Jane has been at the forefront of this, and without risking myself by putting him on the spot, I think he could add some insights from his many, many years of working in this particular area. Thank you, Professor Mkandawire.
Okay, good. Tom, would you like to respond on how best do we engage national governments with these well-crafted policies which we have generated? Again, this is part of the Abuja. How do we really go out there to Abuja and engage those governments and convince them that what we're putting on the table is really the future for agriculture transformation?
Right. Okay. Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I think that our challenge as researchers is to be more explicit and specific about exactly what it is we're proposing that governments do. I think everyone would agree that this conversation that we're having is really highlighting the importance of agricultural R&D, adaptive R&D, so that the germplasm that's generated internationally can be properly adapted to the different microclimates of African agriculture. Pedro and Prof. Lal mentioned about the importance of getting the blends, the fertilizer blends correct, micronutrient deficiencies, and this is, again, something that is quite diverse. So sulfur is not needed everywhere, but it is needed in some places, and these soil maps that Pedro referred to can become, if they're utilized properly, can become very effective in helping farmers to increase their yield response to the inputs that are put in. There's been a lot of discussion about how, the need for greater use of organic inputs. And, many people have talked about the constraints that farmers face in doing that. So here's where I think we, as a sort of a interdisciplinary group of soil scientists, agronomists, and economists and others, need to come together to help propose things that could actually break the constraints that farmers are facing to applying more organic matter. In many areas, especially the more semi-arid areas where it only rains for 3 or 4 months out of the year, the supply of organic matter to reincorporate into the soil is often a constraint. There just isn't enough of it available locally to put in the kind of organic matter that's required. So this is something that I think we need to work on together. And I'm very tempted to ask the keynote speaker, who made a very, impassioned case for why we need more soil organic matter to be put back in order to make fertilizer profitable. What can the public sector do to help farmers to be in a better position to reincorporate organic matter to produce more of it. I think we'll need help from the soil scientists on those kind of issues that we can then put into the Abuja II discussions going forward and provide concrete guidance to governments and the Africa Union about how to achieve these kind of things that we've been talking about in this session today. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Tom. That's a very important point. Concrete guidance by researchers, particularly those working in the area of soil health as well. Maybe let me turn to Elizabeth. I mean, you're a very powerful voice in Africa as a young entrepreneur, also as president of the Pan-African Farmers Organization. You are very key. And is it not the case that we as researchers, sometimes we lack legitimacy? The real legitimacy comes from people like Elizabeth, who is both a technical, but she's also a farmer, and she sits on this continental Pan-African organization. Maybe again to you, Elizabeth, how can these researchers from ReNAPRI and other institutions work with you in the Pan-African Organization of Farmers in taking some of these issues jointly with you to the African leaders and Abuja II?
Professor, let me just come in. Elizabeth has had to step out into another meeting, but she has left a message and said she is ready to engage further with yourselves on this panel if you need her input into the road to Abuja. So she left that message for you.
Absolutely. So my plea is that I think we as researchers, we need to bring individuals like Elizabeth on board because they have much greater legitimacy than we have in speaking at these continental forums. But very often we do not actually provide them with sufficient information. So the need for engaging them and allowing them to understand, some of these policy options becomes extremely critical. So that's the homework, I believe, for ReNAPRI to look at. Maybe since Pedro is around, we've got one question around bushfires. Somebody is saying that these bushfires destroy organic matter, and yet we hardly address the challenges of bushfires in destroying organic matters. What policy options do we want to put on the table, assuming that this is an important issue, or is it a non-issue? I think that's the question. Pedro, bushfires,
okay.
Is it an issue?
Okay, Richard, thank you. I'll talk about this, but then give me a chance to talk about a broader issue afterwards. The bushfires destroy the plant carbon and therefore the organic matter in above ground plants. But the effect on soil organic carbon is very limited. Maybe the top inch or so of the topsoil, depending on this texture, is affected. But after that, there's essentially no effect. The temperatures do not change very much from the normal temperatures. So the point I'm trying to make is the effect of bushfires on soil organic carbon in the soil is very limited. Now, I wanted to talk about something else, if I may, Richard. Well,
yes, please. Yeah.
Okay. My personal successes in influencing policy were related when, through local key people like you, Richard, facilitated a meeting with the head of state, and flat out, we gave a recommendation for to the head of state of, in this case, subsidized fertilizer and hybrid maize seeds. I failed in other countries, including where I was living in Kenya, when the president didn't even ask a question or care very much about what we were doing. No mention of who the president was. But so sometimes there is no prophet in your own land, and you can make use of prophets from outside. But the important key here is to have the key intermediary. The spokesman may be a different issue, but the key intermediary is the people in the country who can access the highest level of government because they are in that position. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you, Pedro. Yeah. Right. Well, maybe let me just get back to the panelists. Maybe each one of you can actually give a quick reflection on this conversation with very specific messages that you believe we should take, one or two. I know you raised a number of them, but the whole idea is to give a message of hope to the African leaders, because it's very easy for our leaders to be fatalistic, and all of us to be fatalistic that, you know, oh, Africa is not going anywhere. And yet, you know, from some of the work you've been doing at ReNAPRI, including my friends such as Tom Jane, you know, there is a message of hope there that things are working elsewhere. But very often we don't give this positive message of hope to these African leaders. In this space of enhancing agriculture productivity, what are the key messages of hope that we can actually present to these African leaders? You know, we can start with, you know, maybe Hambulo.
Thank you, Professor Mkandawire. I think my probably last words would be that I firmly believe that the future of African agriculture is green, and through the continental initiatives like the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, the Abuja II Fertilizers, or the Africa Fertilizer Summit 2, or whatever it will be called eventually, I think we have a real opportunity to address some of the challenges that affect the growth of agricultural productivity in Africa. And it would be an opportunity for all stakeholders, national governments included, Africa-wide institutions and other partners to come together and see how best we can sustainably increase the use of fertilizers. Not only that, but also increase the efficiency of fertilizer use, and also address the different bottlenecks that smallholder farmers face insofar as accessing fertilizer is concerned, including the cost of fertilizers, the responsiveness of fertilizers to, responsiveness of crops to fertilizers, and also related challenges of low adoption of climate smart agriculture. So I think there's hope that if we all come together through this Abuja II process, we can increase agricultural productivity in Africa and address hunger and poverty in a more sustainable manner, while it's also addressing the vagaries of climate change. I thank you, Professor. And as ReNAPRI, we stand ready to partner with the different stakeholders that were represented on this call and others that are not on this call, both on the continent and in the global north. Thank you so much.
Let me turn over to Rob. Rob, again, as a scientist, also as a farmer, and of course, as an Africanist, in the sense that you have lived in Africa for the rest of your life. At least half of your life has been spent in Africa. What do you see as really key messages of hope that we should really be putting on the table to excite these African leaders that things are happening? There is actually the possibility of enhancing agriculture productivity in Africa. Maybe 2 or 3 messages of hope.
Apologies from Rob, Prof. He left earlier for another meeting.
Oh, he's gone.
Yes,
well,
Prof.
then, Pedro, maybe, again, I know you have raised an important issues there. Maybe, again, let me turn to you also, given your unconditional commitment to Africa.
Okay.
What is
okay.
hope you can give the leaders?
Again, let's think a way to get the message to the presidents and the ministers of agriculture and industry that hopefully will attend the Abuja II meeting. If you put them all in front of a large audience and you ask them, would you please do this and do that? They'll probably say yes. So I don't believe in these large meetings. If we could have a system organized in which some of us, including Hambulo, the people here in ReNAPRI, could have a fairly private meeting with the president or prime minister about this is what we need. Maybe facilitated by the president of the African Development Bank or something like that. But something that you can transmit the message, not in public where they will smile and say yes, but something that they'll have a way to think about it and present it in a way that is specific to their country. I think under the leadership of the president of the African Development Bank, we could do a lot of that. That's my idea.
Absolutely. No. Well, I mean, we see you again, Pedro, as one of our ambassadors. Would like to join efforts as ReNAPRI and other African institutions in going to these, as individuals, but also as maybe groups. So again, we will look very carefully at what are the next big events where there might be that opportunity, even before the summit, of interacting with these African leaders. Any last word from anybody else?
Yeah, Chair, this is Tom again. I like Pedro's idea. I just want to ask him and others if that meeting could be arranged with various African presidents, and if one of them said, well, tell me exactly what should I be doing? What should the Ministry of Agriculture do to facilitate this? What would be the answer to that?
The answer in public may be very different from the answer in a private setting. So that's why I suggest that the question be asked or lead the Prime Minister to say, what should X country do? What should my country do? But don't do it with 1,000 participants.
Right.
Do it small. Do it small and well orchestrated people that he would listen to.
Thank you.
Wonderful. I think we should come to a conclusion. First, of course, for me to thank the keynote speaker. He's gone to another meeting, and to thank all the panelists. We see this as a truly coalition of the willing in moving towards Abuja II Fertilizer Summit. And again, the only way that we will push this agenda is if we are seen as a part of a global network, not just African network, but a global network that are all committed to advancing the agenda of enhancing agricultural productivity in Africa. So we definitely would like to follow up with all of you as individuals, but also as a group on next steps, including some of the very well suggested interventions. But more importantly, I'd like to appeal to my colleagues in ReNAPRI that please, let's make it a point in engaging our governments. Each one of us, we should actually engage our national governments and put on the table what we can do to support them, not just in this area of fertilizer and enhancing agricultural productivity, but many, many other areas, including, the harmonization of, their policies with regional policies around agriculture productivity enhancement, and multiple other areas where they need for harmonization. But making ourselves that we are there to support them would be extremely important, including supporting them on progress that has been achieved since Abuja Fertilizer Summit of 2006. We should present ourselves that we are ready to do that. In the same wavelength, I think we should reach out to SADC as well as COMESA and ECOWAS as well, that, you know, we are here as a regional institution and as institutions working with our partners from northern institutions in support of those regional economic communities. I know that we are going to have conversations with COMESA quite soon, maybe in the first week of December, to present ourselves that we're here to work with COMESA. And I would like thereafter to see whether we can talk to the ministers of agriculture at the COMESA, you know, level. And then from there, we can move on to talk to the other ministers in the other regional economic communities. So once again, I would like to say, you know, we appreciate your participation. And this has been an excellent conversation. And I'm sure our colleagues in ReNAPRI have taken a record of the important you know, messages that have come out of this discussion, which will guide us in speaking to the African Union Commission and expressing our readiness to work with them in preparation for the next summit. Much appreciated to everybody. Thank you. Nalishew, over to you.
Thank you, Professor. So let me also join Dr. Hambulo Ngoma in recognizing the great minds that have spoken in this webinar. These are great minds. Eleanor Roosevelt says, great minds discuss ideas. So it's happy to have had great minds speaking in this webinar. The keynote presenter, Professor Rattan, whom I have interacted with in another webinar. Thank you for the opportunity. And his colleague and friend, Professor Pedro Sanchez, meeting you for the first time, but I've heard a lot about you. Professor Mkandawire, of course, very seasoned African agriculture activist, expert, name it. Professor Tom Jane, thank you for stepping in when Professor Mkandawire was still trying to join us. Madam President of PAFO, Elizabeth Nsimadala, I'm sure you all valued her contributions to this conversation. Member of the Governing Council of the African Fertilizer Financing Mechanism, Robert Groot from IFDC. Thank you, Dr. Hambulo from IAPRI and ReNAPRI. Your own contributions have been appreciated, and thank you for being one of the leaders in ReNAPRI when it comes to issues around fertilizer. This webinar, as you may all agree with me, has been amazing. It has been rich, it has been honest, informative, and filled with a number of key messages ahead of the Abuja II summit. I'm sure my senior colleagues from ReNAPRI have taken on board all the points that have come out of this conversation.